Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in our Sherman's March to the Sea series, which was conducted at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah, Georgia in February of 1996. Our speaker is already becoming familiar and old friend. Herman Hattaway, a professor of history at the University of Missouri at Kansas City, has previously spoken at our Vicksburg and our Overland Campaign series, or not Overland Campaign, but 1864 Tennessee Campaign series. Herman told me jokingly some years later that he would go anywhere that somebody paid for his ticket and fed him 2 or 3 times and gave him a nice hotel bed to sleep in. All he had to do was give a talk or two. That joking aside, Herman really did enjoy interacting with people. He was a salesman. I mean, every time he went out, as you've already heard, he will sell you on his books and tell you how wonderful they are. But I will also give the man his due. Herman promoted us. He did a book, Shades of Blue and Gray, which was a fairly concise summary of the Civil War that a lot of the historians were doing in those days. And he gave the Blue and Gray a great deal of credit. And more than that, he picked up one of our early monographs on a study in warfighting, Nathan Bedford Forrest at the Battle of Price's Crossroads, and gave Parker Hills and the Blue and Gray a nice shout out in his acknowledgments, both within the book and then in the acknowledgments also. So Herman certainly gave as good as he took, and I find that for all Herman's eccentricities, he certainly was one of the giants of the Civil War community. I haven't heard of Herman in quite some time. This, of course, being 2020, and this lecture being done almost 25 years ago. I would think that if Herman is still with us, he's certainly retired and very aged. I would think he'd be approaching 90 years old now. So this was back when Herman was in his prime. And this talk is more in line with his speculative nature of his interaction with Bill Steele and Richard Behringer and Archer Jones. And he speculates on the March to the Sea, and he asks a very provocative question. Was there another agenda? And I think that's well worth considering. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy Herman Hattaway's presentation of Sherman's March to the Sea. Was there another agenda?
And certainly our first speaker is equally a luminary in his own light, and then some. Herman Hattaway is a nationally recognized scholar, as are all these people. He has written extensively on the Civil War. You see just a few of his works up here. He is just a marvelous person to work with. His books have been co-authored, some have been written on their own. They are award-winning books. They reflect insight and a direct discussion and thought on the Civil War. They are not just recitations of books. They actually provoke thought about the meaning of the war, and that's the way that Herman presents his programs. This afternoon, when we had the very good fortune of adding Lee Kinnett to the program, Herman shifted his emphasis of what he was going to speak to today and said, I have something that I would like to present because I think it is thought-provoking. It is something that perhaps you would not consider as significant in the context of the March to the Sea. And he proposed it to me, and I thought it's something that we could all reflect on and perhaps find as good cause for discussion. So I'm very, very proud and pleased to welcome one of our best friends to the Georgia Historical Society in this seminar. Please welcome Herman Hattaway.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I have to apologize to you all. I woke up this morning with quite a bit of congestion and I've been kind of fighting those symptoms since, so I'm not sure how this is going to work out. We'll see. Maybe I'll sort of settle down and level off. I'm truly glad to be here with the Blue-Gray Education Society for my third time with this group. I was on the Jackson, Mississippi program and the Nashville, Tennessee program last year, and then as it turns out, I think this is the first of 3 times that I'm scheduled to be with the Blue-Gray Education Society this season. I think I'm with you for Petersburg and Lee's Retreat and Mississippi then again. I do want to thank Lynn for thinking of the title of this presentation. Was there another agenda? That's a good title. I don't think I'm really great at coming up with titles. Not that I really lay claim to being the one who thought of how the North won or why the South lost, but my friend Jack Davis suggests that I really now need to do a third book about the same size and scope that would be entitled Why the West Coast Did Not Matter. But the East Coast mattered, and quite a lot, because the Confederacy placed great hope in being able to maintain international trade, in being able to get through the Union blockade, and perhaps ultimately being able to break that blockade. Perhaps, and one they might have hoped, with foreign aid, or perhaps the Confederacy itself could do enough potent things to demolish, ultimately, the blockade. And in the book, Why the South Lost, co-authored with 3 other historians, is quite a lot of material on the blockade and its impact on the question why the South lost. And we wanted to say at the outset that why the South lost was not the blockade. The blockade was not decisive and most assuredly not scale-tipping, but it did become ever more effective each year as a year passed and faded into another. It did become ever more effective. And yet, Wilmington, North Carolina was open, and so open, even in 1865, that one could book passage. You could actually be a passenger and go through the blockade out of Wilmington. Savannah did not fare so well, but Savannah was significant to the Confederates for a long time, because even though the Union did have some very effective blockade vessels in the South Atlantic blockade fleet, and also some very significant occupations on the sea islands, it still was a complicated thing to completely seal off Savannah. And because of all the different possible routes and all the inland waterways that could be traversed, and were indeed traversed, that there was viable hope for Savannah. And then there was also viable hope, you might be surprised to think about it in these terms, to develop other seaports on the Confederate coast that had not previously been extant as significant seaports. And this was not a altogether pie-in-the-sky, meaningless thing. If the war had gone more uphill instead of more drastically downhill for the Confederacy, it is conceivable that other seaports perhaps could have been developed. My friend Richard Behringer is not altogether happy with the reality that Why the South Lost was credited 25%, 25%, 25%. So, because Bill Still, William N. Still, Jr., of a truth, did not do 25% of the work. It was really more of a 30-30-30-10 book, but we had to have Still. We had to have Still because I don't think the rest of the scholarly world would have believed the three of us without him, or even if there had been a fourth, without the credential that Bill Still had as an impeccable scholar of naval affairs, both in the Union and in the Confederacy. Because what we did say was that history tends to overemphasize the effectiveness of the blockade, that it was a dangerous and an iffy thing to be sure, but the blockade could be run, and often was, and was being run close to the very end. But what I'm going to talk more about today with you has to do with the alleged other agenda, which would have been to tip the scale by wreaking enormous havoc on the possessions of the Union, which would include their blockading fleet, and couple that with the war weariness factor, which had been certainly very significant up at least until the fall of Atlanta. You know, that looking back, we do know that the northern populace general will to continue to the end was at its lowest ebb in the summer of 1864. And if the tide had not turned as it did, it had looked to so many that Atlanta might hang on a longer time, a lot longer time than it did. It had looked to many that President Abraham Lincoln, it actually looked to him as well, that he might not be reelected. And the Confederates actually had a raiding party approach within 5 miles of Washington, D.C. That's Jubal Early's famous foray that actually resulted in President Abraham Lincoln coming under enemy fire at Fort Stevens. Interesting and dramatic moment. Well, you know, the Civil War is such an enormous package of what-ifs, and I'll touch on at least a couple more. But what if Abraham Lincoln had taken a bullet right between the eyes at Fort Stevens when he stuck his head up to look, and when a young captain allegedly shouted to him, "Get down, you damn fool, before you get shot"? Well, he might have been shot, but he wasn't. Well, now, I say I like the title, Was There Another Agenda? And it gives me something to play with here. And I have to confess that in large measure, although with some degree of seriousness, I'm playing today. I don't know that I could or would publish this, certainly not in quite precisely the same format that I have it here. Was there another agenda? I think I have to admit the answer is no. Certainly not in terms of a formal, full-blown, viable agenda. But for an unknown number of fanatically dedicated people, and some of them brilliant and innovative people, there was another agenda. And Civil War scholarship is tremendously fascinating, interesting. We seem to have, and those of us who write them hope that indeed there is, no end to the flow of new and interesting and worthwhile and saleable books and articles on the Confederacy, or the Union, or the war itself. How did I do recovering from that unguarded aside, saying the Confederacy when I meant the Civil War as a whole? You know, it's been quasi-sinusoidal ever since the war itself ended. I mean, there was tremendous interest during the war, obviously in the war, but there was tremendous interest in what the history of the war might be like. And there even began to be stamp collectors active during the Confederacy while the war was still going on. So, as I say, quasi-sinusoidal, and we're now in a new boom catalyzed by the Ken Burns series. There's a lot wrong with the Ken Burns series, and that's not my topic now today, although I know I got in the mail just the other day a little book that looks awfully interesting. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. The Ken Burns series, The Historian's Response. And there's been a lot of response, but among those responses has been this tremendous crescendo and chorus of thank you, Ken, from many of us, because a lot of us have profited in many ways from the tremendous upswing in the fall of 1990, when that series first aired. And how I benefited directly was that the University of Illinois Press elected to put How the North Won into an unabridged paperback edition. They didn't want to do that. It is still in print. Oh, I see we don't have any here, in hardbound copies, and the press, well, those that really want that book will pay for the hardback edition, and it's too big a book to sell in paperback. And Archer Jones and I, the two co-authors of that book, had just about decided to give in, and in fact, I had already prepared a letter to Richard Wentworth, the director of the Illinois Press, said, all right, we'll do an abridged version. And then along comes Ken Burns, and we get the word from Illinois, well, okay, we'll go with an unabridged paperback. Now, on the other hand, from the quasi-ridiculous to the quasi-sublime, maybe, if that's a fair way of putting it, I did just now recently get another letter from Richard Wentworth. This is just a couple of weeks ago. He says, I have great news. The Eastern Press is going to issue a leather-bound edition of How the North Won. And that's true. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm very much looking forward to that. We're enormously proud and pleased of the reality that not only is How the North Won still in print in hardbound, but also in unabridged paperback, but now soon in collector's edition leather as well. Well, some Civil War scholarship is interpolative in nature. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just a real thing that is worth taking into account. In other words, while the vast mass of Civil War scholarship may be in a more conventional vein, solid research based on the tremendously large available body of primary material and of secondary material that is so stimulating and interesting, from time to time there come scholars who have the ability and, because of what they're trying to do, the need to make little leaps. Well, actually, the professional historian is always supposed to do that anyway. The historian, it is alleged, attempts to approach truth always through probability, and is rarely utterly sure that he's quite precisely and totally correct. He thinks it's probably correct. He probably believes this, or he believes that this is probable. Well, there's a lot of stuff that that's the best we can do. And the work, for example, of the Secret Service of the Confederate States falls into that category. For indeed, you see, if there was another agenda, it might well have had a lot to do with an effective, able, and viable, and potent, and achieving Confederate Secret Service. Well, William Tidwell, Tidwall, is recently, and he had a few collaborators on an earlier work, and I see now he has a work quite recently out on these broad general themes that he has singularly authored. So the earlier one is called Come Retribution. And then the more recent one, I don't even know the title, but maybe somebody here does. It's very recently out. Let's see, Come Retribution was published by the University of Mississippi Press, the same press that did my first book, and one of my more recent ones, which we also don't have here, called Letters from Forest Place, which would have been interesting, I think, to some of you, especially the ladies. Letters from Forest Place is a book-length compendium of letters that a Mississippi plantation family comprised of a somewhat of a tyrant father and a most interesting mother and two daughters as they're growing up, and all these letters that are passed back from school and early marriage between the daughters and the mother mostly. Letters from Forest Place. Well, I don't know. Some scholars think that Tidwell and his co-authors with Come Retribution were too interpolative, and I've heard it bad-mouthed by a few. And I was very amused. I was at a professional meeting, a meeting of professional scholars, the Southern Historical Association, and there was a session that involved much this sort of thing. And one guy on the panel, I wasn't on the panel, I was in the audience, but one guy on the panel just got up and delivered himself of a series of bad-mouthed comments on that kind of history, and that history in particular, Come Retribution. And so, after a little discussion, bounced back and forth, I got up and I said, now let me ask you this. Suppose the University of Mississippi Press had sent this typescript when it was, being considered to you, instead of to me, which they did, would this book have ever seen the light of day? And he had to admit, no, he wouldn't have allowed it to be published. Mark Neely, it was also on that platform, and I asked him the same question, and he said, and because he was also taking the negative position, but he did say that, well, yes, he could bring himself to recommend stuff to be published that he actually disagreed with. Well, the South had a greater propensity to experiment. The weaker side in war often does do this. The weaker side, knowing that it has a material disadvantage, is sometimes more inclined to resort to expedients or perhaps to develop new ideas and new machines, or for that matter, ways to use old machines in a new manner. Within the Confederacy, there were a number of really interesting people who conceived and built and employed a number of remarkable destructive devices. The most widely used of these devices was an improved fuse for artillery shells, which was perfected by one Captain Ambrose McAvoy. Millions of them were produced. But McAvoy also worked on several types of what were then called torpedoes, and which we today call mines. They use the word torpedo as what we call mines. These explosive devices, landmines or water mines, that in fact we seem to be having a lot of trouble with even today in Bosnia. Now, the idea for explosive mines was not entirely new. A primitive one had been used by the colonists against the British in the American Revolution, and methods for improving them had subsequently been toyed with by people like Robert Fulton of steamboat fame and Samuel Colt, the firearms developer. And indeed, just prior to the American Civil War, floating mines had been employed at Canton, China, during the Anglo-French seizure of that place, and by the Russians in the Crimean War. But only the men who developed these things seemed to take them seriously, and they were slow to catch on. But some technically minded Americans noted these things individuals, especially within the Confederacy, following the lead of Gabriel J. Rains, R-A-I-N-S, developed these things to a surprisingly sophisticated level. The South successfully used these devices to kill hundreds of men, sailors and soldiers, and to sink 29 Federal vessels, and seriously damage another 5 Federal vessels, and inflict minor damage on a large number of others. The South also developed 2 ingenious kinds of new hand-delivered bombs. These were designed and built by the extremely innovative and small, but we don't really know how small, or therefore how large, Confederate Secret Service Corps, organized and led by Captain Thomas E. Courtney. And I'll have some more to say about Courtney later. This group worked on explosives that were fitted into sticks of wood. And one of the members of the Secret Service Corps designed a clock-activated torpedo. And their crowning achievement was conceived by Courtney himself. Highly explosive, small, cast-iron torpedoes that were serrated and irregularly notched and toothed on the edges and painted. Now, believe this, they looked like lumps of coal. These became the principal weapon of the Confederate Secret Service Corps toward the end of the war. Rather little is known about the coal lump torpedoes because there was scrupulous secrecy maintained concerning them, and the main files of the Confederate Secret Service Corps were deliberately destroyed just before the Confederate Capitol fell. But one sample of the device was secured by the Union occupying troops, one that had been presented to President Jefferson Davis, who in fleeing had forgotten about it in a cabinet of his personal possessions. Now, of course, the idea of the coal lump torpedo is to somehow sneak them into supplies of Union coal. Many Southerners, perhaps, no doubt, hoped that these might wind up someday either in the boiler of a Federal ship or maybe even in some Union officer's pot-bellied stove. Now, we do not know how many of these devices were made, and we do not know how many of them were used. And it may well be that we can never know this, but we're finding out more and more things. We're finding new pieces of evidence, and then they're interrelated through interpolation. And we do know that a number of mysterious explosions that we don't know what caused did occur. The ultimate problem is that nearly all of the impressive, innovative devices developed and used by the South, including even submarines and observation balloons, although the Union took the lead in that, the South countered and also had air power. All of these were too primitive, too unreliable, and most significantly, and this is ultimately it, they were never available in sufficient numbers, or could not be used in conjunction with other orchestrated endeavors to bring more than relatively momentary impact, although they did bring that in a number of instances. What that all ultimately adds up to is that it's still another of the crucial ways in which the South, the Civil War was a harbinger of much more complex conflict yet to come, and the South did rather a lot in the way of stimulating that development. The first instance, perhaps, that deserves to be mentioned comes early in the war, in the Virginia theater, when during George B. McClellan's campaign up the peninsula, beginning to move up the peninsula on the 17th of March, 1862, at Yorktown, a small but magnificently managed, for the moment, Confederate force played the role of delayer. Among the ways they did this was to put out a lot of tree trunks painted black. These are among the so-called Quaker guns. They won't shoot, but maybe they look dangerous, and some from a distance they do. Parading men in and out of sight to suggest that they're more than they really are. But also very significant in the Confederate defense at Yorktown is the first employment in the Civil War of torpedoes, which we today would call mobs. Now, one of the Confederate division commanders, Brigadier General Gabriel J. Rains, dusts off and improves an idea that he had had 22 years earlier in the Second Seminole War. And in this first episode, a hapless Federal rider and his horse were thrown some distance by an explosion. And the larger effect was psychological. Thereafter, soldiers occasionally thought that they saw torpedoes literally everywhere. Well, General McClellan was just outraged by what he believed to be an uncivilized act of barbarism. And he complained, and the Confederate High Command gave some sober thought. Maybe the complaints were valid. Maybe this is a savage act of barbarism, and we don't want to do this sort of thing. The Confederate Secretary of War pondered the issue and finally made a ruling that it all depended on how the torpedoes were used. If you were going to use torpedoes to, say, kill pickets, not George Pickets, but guys, guards out there, that would be gratuitous murder. But it would be an acceptable thing to use torpedoes to kill generals. And a strange set of rules, mostly unofficial but agreed upon, eventually evolved. Mines should not be used to kill merely for the sake of killing. But it would be all right to use them to delay pursuits, to repel attacks, and to protect rivers and harbors. And so torpedoes of various types rapidly were deployed in virtually all of the South's inland and coastal waterways, and the Savannah waterways were no exception. And then, of course, to go ahead of the story, they would also be planted in the sandy regions of the defensive areas as well. And if you've seen the movie Glory, you know about one of the truly spectacular instances where lots of torpedoes were deployed in a sandy location very effectively. The thing about Fort Wagner is that it was never actually taken. It subsequently was declared untenable and was surrendered, but never actually taken because it was so strongly defended, and largely because of these explosive devices. Well, the Federals, of course, in turn were induced to devise defenses. What's one good defense? Well, Sherman thought of that. Send captured rebels down the road first. But early in the war, what we see is the devising of the first mine sweepers. Indeed, 30 April 1862 is when the initial use of such a device occurred. Sort of a huge rake, 65 feet long, with a large number of grappling hooks pushed ahead of a lead vessel so that they might cause the premature explosion or somehow pick up and clear the way of these things. Well, there were lots of them, you see, and you never knew when there was going to be one. And so if you could induce people to be afraid that they were out there, you might tie things up pretty well. Now, early in October 1863, the Confederates came close to scoring an achievement of note in the Atlantic coastal waters, because thoughtful Southerners had already begun pondering the problem of transcending the passive nature of torpedoes. You see, the thing is, you have to, you put them out and you have to wait for something to come and trigger them. A passing boat, if it's a water-in-place torpedo, or some body, or horse, or wagon. So Southerners began searching for more positive means of delivery, and they got a lot of encouragement from Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard For that Confederate general happened to show the most interest in technical innovation. Indeed, even from the end of the Shiloh campaign in April of 1862 until near the war's end, Beauregard never stopped giving encouragement to the inventors of the South who were playing with these deadly devices that might have brought the South some advantage. And because during much of this time Beauregard happened to be in command of the defenses at Charleston, and look at a map sometime if you don't know, that's not very far from here, from Savannah, Charleston became the scene of the most significant experimentation. And there, the idea for direct delivery of torpedoes was developed. You would have a small attack boat with a torpedo on the end of a long spar projecting from the bow. And it would approach a target at high speed, and the spar might be raised and lowered by a windlass, and at the critical moment lowered so that it would ram a torpedo a few feet below the water line. Oh, this was great. It of course, much depended on whether the attack vessel could escape damage, and that proved to be a problem. But they did build, actually, some very interesting vessels called Davids, because they were small. Little David going to attack the Goliath. Davids. These things were cigar-shaped with ballast tanks that could be filled or emptied, relatively speaking, by pumps, so you could raise or lower how high the David. In other words, this is kind of a quasi-precursor submarine. It isn't a submarine because it doesn't really completely submerge, but they're working with the idea of going down to just the surface level of the water. And in the waters off Charleston on the night of the 5th of October, 1863, the CSS David attacked the USS New Ironsides. And the David smashed a torpedo up against the iron hull of this vessel. The torpedo exploded. The huge ship was jolted. Rigging came crashing down. Cannon were knocked loose. There was an enormous stream of water shot into the air. So much water shot up into the air that it deluged the David and put its fires out, and the crew abandoned ship. But two of the officers later managed to scramble back aboard the David and relight the fires and bring her home safely. Now, injury to the New Ironsides, the Federal ironclad blockading vessel, at first appeared to be insignificant, but an inspection late in November revealed that very serious damage had been inflicted. Information about this damage was kept secret, and the Confederates never learned while the war was going on the extent of their achievement here. But the vessel, New Ironsides, remained out of action, being repaired for more than a year. Meanwhile, though, on the war went, and these developments just seemed never to be effective enough in any kind of concerted, some sort of strangely out-of-place air. I can feel it. And then the Confederacy did, in fact, develop a submarine. Many thinkers around the globe had long begun to probe the problem of making undersea boats. Much had been written on the concept, quite a lot of this in the United States. The Union did plan to build several submarines, actually did build one in the Washington Navy Yard, but this one was never put into service. There was a lot of problem with the pioneering submarines. They were terribly dangerous, they were terribly unreliable, and the worst thing about them was they were terribly hard to make come back up. But again, the Confederates were the more desperate side. They were more willing to take risks and try to get an operational submarine, and they finally did. On the 17th of February, 1864, the Confederate submarine did score a kill. Now, I told you at the outset, some of this is interpolated history. We do not know how many submarines the Confederacy built. We know for sure that they built more than one. They built at least two. And I'm prepared to argue that they built more than two. But one was found in 1879 near New Orleans in a channel of the Mississippi River. A dredge crew pulled it ashore. This submarine lay in the mud for another generation, but on the 10th of April, 1909, the New Orleans called Beauregard Camp of the United Sons of Confederate Veterans had this thing cleaned up and placed on the bank of the Bayou Teche at the Louisiana State Home for Confederate Veterans. Stayed there till all the Confederate veterans died off, but it was subsequently moved to Jackson Square, New Orleans, and has been ever since on display outside Louisiana State Museum. It's probably being puked on right at the moment. This is Mardi Gras, you know. This is Mardi Gras weekend. Mardi Gras is this coming Tuesday. But I have seen this submarine and at various points in my life. As far as I know, it's been there all my life. Certainly since I was a little boy, it's been there. And you can see it too, and you should if you find yourself in New Orleans, because, I mean, here's an enormously interesting thing. And one of the most jolting things about it is so small. People find it incredible that a number of human beings actually got inside of this thing and took her down. But they did. And in fact, as I say, we don't know how many submarines the Confederacy built. We do know that one of them that was built in New Orleans, perhaps this one, did destroy a target barge in Lake Pontchartrain on a trial run. But New Orleans fell early in the war, you know, early '62. And that had been the site of the most significant of the Confederate submarine building efforts. But a group had gotten together, and they already had a sort of a going thing, led by a wealthy sugar broker named Horace L. Hunley, H-U-N-L-E-Y, Horace L. Hunley, who himself became, because of his tremendous interest in this thing, unquestionably the greatest expert of his time on submarine design, construction, and operation. And he attracted a number, and he, of course, financed it. You know, he's the Steve Forbes of the Confederacy. He's kicking a lot of his own money into this project. And as a matter of fact, when by the time Beauregard gets involved in it all and helping, he brings in other people who have some expertise. A very interesting fellow, a guy named W.A. Alexander, a member of the 21st Alabama Infantry Regiment, became part of the team, and he's residually, actually, because Hunley's going to lose his life during the war, so W.A. Alexander is really residually going to be the most significant active person on the Confederacy's submarine team. After New Orleans fell, the submarine equipment and apparatus and building operations shifted to Mobile, Alabama. And there they came up with a lot of good stuff. They powered these things with screw propellers. They experimented with using electric battery-powered motors, but they failed quite completely in that effort. They were never able to get any kind of powered device, and so how the submarine was powered was by hand crank. And they, you know, connect several of these things. You could actually have a crew turning these cranks, 4 or 6 people. The Hunley, the most famous of the Confederate submarines, was 40 feet long, much longer than the small sub that's on display in New Orleans. 40 feet long. I was visiting a little old lady in a nursing home last week, and I was telling her about this, and she said, Why didn't they hook them up to sewing machines? And they could have been pushing on those treadles. See, good idea, actually. Doggone, because they had the sewing machines, see. I mean, it was good thinking. But they didn't think of it. Took a sick little old lady 125 years later. Now, what would submerge the boat would be pump-operated ballast tanks. In other words, you could fill these, you could put more, take on more water, see, get a little heavier, and also diving vanes, which projected like wings from the side. It's almost like an airplane, see? And once you get them, dip them under the surface and turn them down, and dive, 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 see? Now, the compass wouldn't work. They tried it and discovered that it wouldn't in this iron vessel underwater. And they didn't have any light except a candle, which on the one hand, they was burning their oxygen, because they did not have, tanks of oxygen. On the other hand, when the flame of that candle began to get down to a pinprick, let's take her back up, if we can. and dives tended to be short, and then they go by dead reckoning, because they sure as hell couldn't see where they were going. And then they come back up, get some air, and look, and maybe correct course, and go back down. So it's porpoise-like. But they got to where they were pretty good at this. They got to where they could stay down for a half hour at a time. That's a long time when you think about it. And the famous submarine, the one that's later going to be renamed, the CSS Hundley, set a new record, 2 hours and 35 minutes below the surface with no artificial air, but it's 40 feet long. And came back up and they were okay. It's incredible. It's incredible. Now, they were trying, as long as they were still working in Mobile, to deliver the torpedo pretty much the same way that David did. That is to say, from the front with a rigid spar. And it's amusingly interesting because I think it would have been terrible to try to do that with a submarine. Well, actually, that is what they did. That's ultimately how they did it. They played with other ideas to include the doctrine of attack would be attach the submarine to the torpedo by rope or chain, and let's try to dive under the target vessel and then just come up enough to have that sucker. And that was a good idea, except that they had no control over the torpedo and where it was going, and sometimes maybe that torpedo was going as fast as the submarine was, and they didn't like that idea. So I said, okay, we are in fact going to try it. We're going to try to push the torpedo ahead just like the Davids. Now, it was in August of 1863, the submariners were transferred from Mobile to Charleston. They hauled the sub that they'd been working on railroad flat cars. And after a few practice dives out of Charleston, a fatal accident occurred on the 29th of August, 1863. And then they fished the thing up, where's this thing? Well, there it is, and they fished it back up, they cleaned it off, get those dead bodies out. And now, Hundley himself decides to pilot the vessel. And he knows a lot, really, about it. But on the 15th of October, 63, he took her down, and he didn't come up alive either. It's always amazing, though. Fished it back up, and you could get volunteers. We'll do it. And so they get another volunteer crew, and we do not, now see, this is 3. And we do not know how many there were crews that perished. Again, because we don't have all these records. Okay, that's when they decided to rename the vessel the CSS Hundley in honor of this prominent man. And that also, interestingly, is when they established the world's first submarine school. Because they'd been using people they'd picked up from the Navy and said, well, somehow, maybe we better have some formal instruction. So they did, in fact, at Mount Pleasant on the north side of Charleston Harbor, run a submarine school. And then the Hunley began making practice dives and regular cruising. Now, it needed, if it was going to attack, it needed a lot of things. It needed an ebb tide to send out, a flood tide to return, the wind had to be scant, the moon had to be dark. But a night like that came. On the 14th of February, 1864, Hunley cast off on a history-making voyage, aiming at the USS Housatonic, a 270-foot-long screw-driven sloop with a 100-pound Parrott rifle, three 30-pound Parrott rifles, and other weapons, and a displacement of 1,240 tons. This is a big boat. A warning did sound at the last minute, but it was too late. The torpedo did explode, and Housatonic sank. Most of the group was picked up, but 5 sailors were never found again. And meanwhile, what of the Hunley? Well, the Federals assumed that it escaped, and the Confederates fervently hoped that it did, but the Hunley did not come back. Now, this is one of the interesting things that has not yet been resolved. The Hunley, according to my friend Milton Perry, in his most interesting book about the infernal machines, the Hunley allegedly was found, and not so many years later, a diver spotted the wreckage of the Hunley. And remember I told you about this guy, W.A. Alexander, Ben Hunley's, H.L. Hunley's friend and associate. And he's still alive, late 19th century. In fact, Alexander, writes an article about it, published in the Papers of the Southern Historical Society, volume 30, 1902, that is supposedly based, now this is from Milton F. Perry, Infernal Machines, who used to be, he's dead, but he was wound up being a close friend of mine, and in fact his grandson now calls every now and then, 12 or 13-year-old boy wants to come shovel the walk. So it's a strangely interesting and small world. See, when I was in graduate school, I read about this famous book, and then I subsequently wound up being actually a close personal friend of this guy, Milton F. Perry. But Alexander, and Perry cites not only Alexander's article, but also some material in the Matthew Fontaine Maury papers, and also some stuff in the official records Navy. So I haven't had an opportunity to check this out. Anyway, to the point, Alexander believed that the wreckage of the Hunley had been found, and where it was very near the wreckage of the Housatonic. And Alexander theorized that Housatonic had sunk on top of the Hunley and crushed it and destroyed it, but the wreckage is there. According to these sources cited by Perry, there is the wreckage of a submarine there. Well, now, in, this is the Kansas City Star, 12 May 95, Confederate submarine that sank Union ship found. Now, this is a very different location. It is off the coast of Charleston, but it's a long way from the wreckage of the Housatonic. It's obviously a different wreckage, but they think it is, somebody thinks it's the Hunley. And there's a big argument over exactly who owns this thing and who might have some financial right to it. And on it goes, and then here's the November 95 issue of the Civil War News. The location remains a secret. The adventurer author Cleve Cussler continues to withhold the exact location of the wreck and hasn't been specific about it or when and if he'll release it, again pending all this argument. Well, the point is, don't you see, somebody's wrong about something, or there's more than one submarine. Now, I don't know what, but isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Now, on the 9th of August, 64, the Confederates scored a spectacular but isolated and uncapitalized upon success, and that was the tremendous explosion at City Point, Virginia, where the Union had established a huge supply depot, and where the explosion killed 58 people and wounded another 126, and did property damage in excess of $4 million, and came close to killing General Grant, who was present. It was one of the greatest explosive eruptions of the Civil War, a blast so powerful that it hurled a McClellan saddle through the air into a crowd of people like a bowling ball, killed the guy that it hit in the stomach with, and actually came awfully close to killing U.S. Grant, who happened himself to be there at the time. It was not until after the war that the cause of the explosion at City Point became known. This had been the result of a hand-delivered clockwork torpedo. It contained 12 pounds of explosive. It was disguised as a wooden box of candles. A Confederate Secret Service man, Captain John Maxwell, had perfected this device, and on the 16th of July, 1864, with a companion, had left Richmond, Virginia, carrying it, bringing it by dawn of the 9th of August to City Point. They crawled through the picket lines. They bluffed their way in. Maxwell spooked a guard who knew only a little English, speaking rapidly in a very difficult to understand Scottish dialect. He got aboard a boat. He handed the box to a black laborer and said, "The captain wants this stowed below right away." The black laborer took her down below, and it exploded. And there was an unknown number of sympathetic detonations, ammunition and powder stores so loud that it permanently deafened Maxwell's companion, considerably shook up Maxwell himself, but the two did escape. And it was an enormous success, by far the greatest of its kind achieved during the war. So, Thomas E. Courtney, who had headed the Confederate Secret Service, may well have devised any number of other devices, and some of them may have been used. We don't know. Courtney had been born in 1822. He was a native Irish, but had moved to the United States and was a cotton broker in St. Louis. So he's in his early 40s during the war. He made known his interest in this kind of warfare, and Special Orders number 135, August 1863, authorized him, Courtney, to enlist in the Confederate Secret Service Corps up to 20 men. In December of 1863, he proposed an independent secret service. This earlier one was actually a part of the Army. This is a quasi-military, but not in the chain of command secret service, to be employed in doing injury to the enemy. And he also suggested sending agents into the Union and to the West Indies and to Europe to destroy Federal steam-powered vessels. And it was he who developed the coal lump torpedo. Jefferson Davis was shown one. "The President thinks them perfect," Courtney recorded. The CSA Congress passed a bill authorizing the use of these devices, allocating a percentage of the value of the property that they might destroy as pay for the Secret Service methods. Jefferson Davis signed this bill on the 17th of February, 1864. The War Department furnished all the chemicals that they needed, and most notably, of course, it's the coal lump torpedoes that they devised. And we do not know, how many were used. There were several mysterious explosions that may well have been the work of Courtney's men. On the 15th of April in 64, Chenango, a paddle-wheel gunboat, exploded when leaving New York Harbor. 11 years later, an anonymous writer, that guy is still with us, in England, alleged himself to be a former member of the Confederate Secret Service, claimed that it was a coal lump. Incidentally, anonymous was on the news today. Let's wait and see how this turns out. Some professor named Daniel Foster of Vassar College has run what he calls lexical overlap analysis and concluded that Primary Colors was authored by Joe Klein, a columnist for Newsweek. Let's see how that turns out. A passenger ship, the City of New London, maybe was damaged by one of the coal-lump torpedoes. The Greyhound was destroyed in the James River on the 27th of November, '64. One former rebel did allege that the Sultana was the victim of a Confederate coal-lump torpedo. Remember, that was mentioned by Ed on the tour yesterday. The Sultana blew up in the Mississippi River in 1865, loaded with released prisoners of war who were being sent back. But there is no proof, and we do not know. After the fall of Richmond, Federal Brigadier General E.H. Ripley found a sample of the coal lump that had been given to Jefferson Davis in the president's private cabinet. My friend Perry concludes, if any of the people who used torpedoes were liable to the hanging, which several prominent Union Confederate generals had threatened for any who did, none would have been a better candidate than Courtney. And late in the war, when things, you see, that's another thing to play with. When did it become inevitable that the war was not going to end with Southern victory or a negotiated peace? Lynn suggested over dinner, night before last, that it was with the fall of Savannah. It was inevitable. At some point, at any event, it became inevitable, and at some point before the war's actual end, Courtney prudently joined his family in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They had been living in Maryland before that, but they all went to Nova Scotia. And interestingly, they subsequently went to England, where for 5 years, Courtney tried to sell his coal-lump torpedo idea to the British government. He did return to the United States, as did most of those who exiled. He in the early 1870s, and he died at the unfortunately premature age of 54 on the 3rd of September, 1876. But you see, for some people, for people like Courtney, for people like Alexander, for people like H.L. Hundley, there was, by God, another agenda. And even though they were far from turning the tide of war, boy, they had some interesting stuff. Thanks.
Questions, speculations?
Maury was a big, largely involved in the
Matthew F. Maury was quite a scientist and thinker, and later he later wrote a lot about the stuff. Yeah, that's true. And in fact, you see, it's in the Maury papers that that Perry cites some material suggesting that they had found the wreckage of the Hundley, which would be separate from this most recently found one. So I haven't had an opportunity to check that out, but yeah, Maury is certainly involved.
Are they going to bring up the one they found?
They are talking about it. These articles that I have indicate that the finders have announced that they will definitely not try to bring it up, but that they have high hopes that monies may be appropriated by some agencies, or perhaps even the state of South Carolina, to bring it up in a good way, so as not to do, so that they aren't destroyed. And because, in fact, according to the article on this one, the vessel is intact. Therefore, there would be the remains of the crew still in there, whatever remains there are. But some buttons, if nothing else. And according to these people, they don't think that the ship was demolished. They think what happened. The explosion weakened some rivets, and it took on water and sank. I think they're probably right. I mean, you really want to know what I think. I think there are not two submarines out there. I think there's one, but it's an unsolved mystery at this point.
Isn't there a monument to this in the Battery at Charleston, the Hundley? There's
I don't
There's
know.
a model near the museum
The
in
model,
Charleston,
yeah.
a model of a Hunley.
Yeah.
There, I think that's maybe what you're thinking about.
Mr.
It's
Keesler.
it's a full-scale model, a full-scale model.
Yeah, that's what I was remembering. I think that's where I saw the thing.
Yeah,
But one of
I
the,
haven't seen it.
apparently, trying to keep up because we live in this area, one of the things that they're concerned about is not knowing how thick the hull is because it was a boiler.
Yeah.
So the question is whether it's paper thin or whether it's an inch thick. They're not sure. I think they're going to have Navy divers go down and try to assay the hull and try to, then they got to have a place to put it
Oh, yeah.
that has the
It needs to be
environmental.
well planned before being
Before they ever
executed.
bring it up, it's got to be in some kind of environmentally
Yeah.
controlled.
And who has personal experience in directing the raising of the USS Cairo has a hand up.
I'll update you to the latest. The Navy Department, the state of South Carolina, Clyde Cussler, there's been a lot of fighting. There is high political interest, particularly in the power of the two senators from your state, that it was taken out of naval history and the naval curator's hands. It's being handled by, on the highest level, the lawyers are involved on the Navy Department. Cussler is slightly PO'd because the Navy, he supplied the coordinates of his finding to the Navy, and the Navy was directed to turn him over to the state of South Carolina. So right now, the state of South Carolina has the coordinates, and it's supposed to be a cooperative venture. In view of the power of the two South Carolina senators, I don't know what the final situation was, but it will have to be very carefully handled, because if it is, which I think, our speaker, I think it is, if you have a vessel rigged up in an underwater archaeological problem, and there are 8 plus 8 or 9 bodies on it, as everybody views a submarine as a tomb or a ship, there will be S to pay if it is not handled in a correct way, because they've already investigated where, if they are the bodies, where they will be, because there's going to be a lot of claims on the bodies. Alabama, and some of them from the 21st Alabama is going to get claimed. South Carolina wants them buried near wherever they're going to put
When they bring it up.
where they bring it up. The VA and the VA, I think, is having final jurisdiction, and I think they're going to follow a policy of probably, which they did on those bodies from the 55th Mass that they dug up over on James Island, and I think they're planning to, if they bring them up right now, at least the government's thinking is, they'll bury them in the National Cemetery down in Beaufort.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
You let air out of it to go down, how do you get it to go back up again?
Well, that's a good question, because obviously you couldn't take on any more there to come back up, but I guess it would seem, obviously I'm guessing, but since it did come back up you put these veins, you changed the position of the veins, just like you
Well, they
say.
pumped the water out. They had pumps. They had manually operated pumps. They would pump the water out.
Well, how do you pump water out when you're underwater?
You pump
Just like water.
out of the tank, and then,
Okay.
then you change the vanes, like you say.
Certainly change the veins and come up. You can pump some of the water out too. Well, that's my mind, frankly. I don't understand that. Okay?
Questions, comments? Thanks very much, Sherman.